Greetings, folks. My name is Ramwes Gamgee, and welcome to Quick and Dirty Roleplaying. In this video, I'll go over the written interview that Dave Thomavor of Dave Thomavor RPG Reviews had with Ben Milton of Questing Beast in his newsletter, mainly with regards to Ben's thoughts on tabletop role-playing game design and my thoughts to specific parts of this interview. So, one question that Dave asked Ben is that if he had a magic wand, what would he change about the RPG industry today? To which Ben responded, I'd love it if RPG core books were mostly full of content to put in your game rather than the rules. The majority of the GM's job is making stuff for players to interact with, but core rules usually offer very little support. Looking back on how I wrote the Quick and Dirty RPG system, it actually has more content for GMs than it does for players, since one of the goals of it was to provide GMs tools so that they can run games with minimal prep. Whereas I provided different oracles for answering yes-no questions, as well as open-ended questions, along with tables to help provide phrases for GMs to interpret, Ben takes the OSR route of providing lots and lots of random tables, as found in products such as Maze Rats and in his upcoming Knave 2nd edition, as he states later on in the interview that he's not very good at creating stories on the fly. This is an understandable sentiment, though in the way that he phrased it, he may have placed a great expectation to create a story on the fly on himself, as opposed to just a plausible outcome of what should happen next, but in multiple iterations, tackling them one at a time. I can't say for sure, since I'm not in his head, but it's good to see his point of view on this matter of how he prefers to generate content on the fly. Personally, I find that if a tabletop role-playing game is rules light, then it would make sense to add lots of content that the GM can have their players interact with. However, the majority of this kind of content can be written in a system-neutral manner as its own separate product, so that it can be adapted into many different tabletop RPG systems. When it comes to describing the difficulty of challenges or the strength of NPC traits, natural language should be used instead of terminology from a particular game. Later on, Ben mentions how random encounter rolls and reaction rolls are core to the OSR, and how old school D&D is almost alone in how dedicated it is to simulating a living world. Even though I started the hobby with 2nd edition AD&D, this was never my experience, as my DM would run his games like a TV series as opposed to a sandbox. I don't blame him for it, as he was simply given the 3 core rulebooks along with the Ravenloft campaign setting, but was probably given no instruction on how to play D&D like the grognards of old. Dave then comments that one of the aspects of OSR-style gaming that he sees cited as a hallmark of the movement is giving players the freedom to approach and solve in-game problems and obstacles. To me, this is something I always assumed of all tabletop role-playing games, and not specifically as a hallmark of the OSR style of gaming. Part of Ben's response to this comment is that he gets enjoyment out of the tactical infinity of tabletop role-playing games, which is something I resonate with as well, and why I bounce off hard from crunchy rule sets that smother the anything may be attempted ethos with its adherence to mastering and min-maxing the system. When asked about his thoughts on game design from systems like Fate, Powered by the Apocalypse / Forged in the Dark, etc., Ben states that he prioritizes immersion when he's running his games, whereas systems like Fate feel too writer's room to him, due to metacurrencies, compels, and so forth. In this respect, I can understand Ben's aversion to Fate. My aversion to it has to do with the use of this writer's room jargon. Excuse me. Mainly with its use of invoking aspects, compelling aspects, and whatnot, instead of just describing stuff that's happening in the game world. I'm also not a fan of the arbitrary method of handing out fate points. I would prefer something more written in stone, such as how with Cortex Prime, whenever one of your dice would come up as a 1, a complication would occur, and you'd receive a plot point. Excuse me. Likewise, if you added a D4 to your pool, to your dice pool from a distinction instead of a D8, that would also award the player the plot point. Both of these methods are taken out of the GM's whims, and one of them even includes a way for the player to generate their own plot points by making things harder for themselves. Regarding the actual writer's room phenomenon, I actually don't mind it, as I like to pull from the ideas and imagination from others at the gaming table to construct really cool scenes and outcomes, and I enjoy doing that. That's the part that I really enjoy about tabletop role-playing games, which would mirror Ben's enjoyment regarding like immersion into like game worlds and whatnot. Some players may find what I describe as immersion breaking, while I don't, or rather, it's not immersion breaking for me. Perhaps my ability to retain my immersion, even with shifts in perspective from being in the situation to the collaborative aspect and then just going back into it. For me, my immersion doesn't break from that. Perhaps my immersion is just more robust than theirs. Ben also mentions how moves in Powered by the Apocalypse style games are really just subsystems, which the OSR is no stranger to. I can't tell you how often I find OSR adherents, or Powered by the Apocalypse haters, on tabletop RPG related forums talk about moves as if they were these incredibly complex mechanics or just antithetical to role-playing games because they limit choices. They're actually just specific iterations of reaction rolls, which are dice rolls that have more than 2 outcomes to them. They've just been extrapolated outward from simply how an NPC first reacts to the PCs and onto other circumstances. If anyone takes issues with PBTA style moves, they take issue with reaction rolls, whether they know it or not. Later on, Ben and Dave discuss the spectrum between role-playing as the character and having the character simply as a stand-in for one's self, and how Ben leans closer to having the PC as his avatar instead of being more of a method actor. Personally, I prefer to go more method actor, since it helps me get more immersed in the game world and helps me make decisions for my character that I wouldn't make for myself, which would typically be to push the button. He also states something very intriguing. The term role-playing game is not the most accurate term for the sort of game that tabletop role-playing games are. While role-playing is an aspect of play, it's not vital to the hobby. What is vital to the hobby is the anything can be attempted ethos from Kriegspiel, the original war game from which the tabletop role-playing game hobby emerged from. Ben also mentions that some OSR players called old school D&D a world-playing game, since long campaigns can see whole parties die off and get replaced with the story of how the world ending up as the long-term focus. Likewise, Ben mentions how in Japan, TTRPGs are referred to as table talk games, which makes a lot of sense since that's the primary activity of the hobby. Ben says that the best description of an OSR campaign might be an immersive, open-ended fantasy challenge simulator. Dave responds to this definition. Dave responds to this definition by stating that while OSR games are about simulating immersive, open-ended fantasy challenges, Powered by the Apocalypse style games are more focused on simulating genres. Ben responds that PBTA games model genres by limiting outcomes via move results and GM principles. This is something that I instinctively object to, because I've never found that my choices in Powered by the Apocalypse style games have been more limited, or have more limited outcomes than traditional tabletop role-playing games that are modeled after old school D&D binary pass-fail mechanics. In every PBTA game that I've ever played or read, there's always the most basic mechanic of doing something under pressure, where you either do it without a hitch, you do it but at a cost, or you pay the price for failure. Aside from the greater variety of results, this is no different than a test in any other tabletop RPG, OSR or not. In fact, I found that I'm presented even more choices with Powered by the Apocalypse style games than with traditional RPGs that use binary yes-no mechanics regarding whether or not I do a thing under pressure. When it comes to mechanics that enforce genre conventions, if I don't like them or if they don't serve me, I can simply remove them or change them if need be. In fact, playbooks, i.e. classes, are the genre conventions I dislike the most, and only engage in them when I concede to playing said genre. And this is something that is taken directly from old school D&D, the idea that everyone has to have a class and a level. Those are basically the parts of the interview that I wanted to talk about. While I'm not a fan of original D&D, AD&D, or games that seek to emulate their diffuse game mechanics, I do appreciate the sandbox approach and content generation tools that sprang forth from them and from the OSR. I also see Powered by the Apocalypse style games as a much maligned cousin of the OSR due to its similar roots in the reaction roll mechanic. If you like or dislike anything that you've seen in this video, please give it a like or dislike and leave a comment, keeping it respectful and relevant. Subscribe if you want to support my channel, and if you really want to support my endeavors, head over to my Patreon and become an appreciative member. The link is in the description. Until then, folks, take care and play to find out what happens.